Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. This week, two men have been found guilty of the Manchester airport attack. It was a video that was circulated widely online and threw up a lot of questions about police brutality, but also media pylons when we don't have the full information about what's happened. Now, to discuss this and what the police force should look like and whether women should be on the front line of the police force, I am joined by Rakib Ehsan. He is a commentator and writer for The Spectator, for Unheard and for Spiked. Rakib, good to have you on Spectator TV. Now, these two men have been found guilty, but a lot of people have seen the footage. They don't actually know what has happened in this court case and what led to this fight between the police officers. So you've been covering the case since it began. What actually happened?
Well, one of the brothers allegedly headbutted a member of the public in the Manchester airport Starbucks. Police were alerted of this, and then the police approached the two brothers. Now, in this process of approaching the two brothers, an altercation broke out. Now, interestingly, the original footage, I'm sure you can remember, Natasha, that the well-known footage in the very early stages of all this showed one of the brothers, Mohammed Fahir Amaaz, who has now been found guilty of assaulting two female police officers, as well as that member of the public at the airport Starbucks, was restrained on the floor, and one of the police officers kicked him in the head. Now, based on that footage, it was completely understandable that this particular police officer was suspended. But the full facts had not emerged. So I felt that there were politicians, members of our media ecosystem who very much jumped to conclusions here. Now, based on the footage, of course, it was right that the police officer was suspended, but there was a great deal of victim framing of the two brothers without there being any real understanding of how this altercation came about in the first place.
Yeah, and do you think that's what the issue was? It was the making these brothers into a victim rather than considering whether they were perpetrators?
No, absolutely. And I think that what it really shows that we need to be a little bit more patient when these events take place. And of course, there's a tendency to provide commentary on a very rapid basis. But I think when it comes to these events, it's just important to take stock and be a little bit patient in terms of understanding the full facts behind these kind of events. And I think that there's one point that I'd make is that there were politicians, members of government, who are very much guilty of this. And I think they need to show a bit more responsibility, especially from their position of public office.
Now, let's talk about some of those MPs. One of them is a Labour MP, Paul Waugh. He is the MP for Rochdale, a very Muslim constituency, would have been under a lot of pressure to make a statement. And he released on his Twitter that the scene was the video was shocking and disturbing, and that he would be meeting with the families of, did he use the word victim? I'm not so sure, but we'll put the tweet on the screen now. Do you think that, I haven't seen an apology from him. He's under a lot of pressure to give an apology. Do you think that you can see how MPs are under a lot of pressure to respond, and then it's sort of like they're damned if they do, they're damned if they don't?
I think that, again, there's it might be a real problem here as well, Natasha, is that there is a degree of anti-police sentiment. And I think that's why people have those prior biases in terms of providing commentary all too readily when there are events involving the police without understanding the full facts behind these events. To my understanding, there has been no official apology issued by Paul Waugh, the MP for Rochdale. And there were also people suggesting that Greater Manchester Police had a history of being uniquely discriminatory against men of Pakistani Muslim origin, which I have to say, Natasha, I find absolutely laughable. Anyone who knows how grooming gang activity in the Greater Manchester area has been woefully mishandled by the public authorities, including Greater Manchester Police's premature closing down of Operation Augusta, with the support of Manchester City Council, will tell you that that is a hugely questionable claim in itself. And I think it's very interesting how racial and religious identity politics worms its way into all kinds of events which take place in modern Britain.
How powerful are Muslim-based constituencies, and how much of an influence do they have on their MPs? It does seem to me like a lot of MPs act, with you talking about the Gaza situation, obviously there's the whole thing with grooming gangs. Their behaviour is very much linked to a perhaps not fear, but an influence from people from Muslim backgrounds. And you and I, Rakib, have talked about the fact that there is no whole Muslim community. They come in lots of different ethnicities and backgrounds, but there does seem to be this overpowering influence that they have on MPs. And is there a fear there, or is it just politics?
I think there's a pressure there. And I think that if we're looking at particularly communities of Pakistani Muslim origin, they're relatively concentrated in particular parts of the country. There's relatively high levels of residential segregation within that ethno-religious group, which means that they can be quite a hefty presence in particular constituencies under our first past the post system, so which encourages a strong link between the local constituents and an individual MP. I don't necessarily buy the idea that the reason why Labour MPs are squeamish, for example, in terms of initially supporting a national statutory inquiry into grooming gangs, that the reason for that is because they're constituents of Pakistani Muslim origin would be hugely against this. If you look at recent polling, it shows that the vast majority of ethnic minority citizens in the country are supportive of a natural statutory inquiry into grooming gangs. And interestingly, they're far more likely than the white British mainstream to actually support the death penalty for those heavily involved in grooming gang activity. I think without blabbering on too much, I think this is the case that grooming gang activity tends to take place in Labour-controlled areas. And I think that's why the Labour government originally was very hesitant to support a grooming gangs inquiry, because it wouldn't portray the political party in a positive light. But I think the point here is that what we are seeing, they're very strong forms of political mobilisation within British Muslim communities, especially those of Pakistani Muslim origin. And of course, that can apply a degree of pressure on particular MPs in certain parts of the country.
Yes, I want to ask you about ethnicity when it comes to crime as well, because Katie Lamb, who we've had on the show recently, has done a lot of work putting the government under pressure to release ethnicity statistics based off different crimes. And I suppose you have a conflict there between, if we keep looking at which ethnicities are committing which crimes, are we really a non-racist Britain that we want to be, or is that really treating everyone the same way, treating everyone equally? And I suppose that's partly why the statistics weren't released in the first place, because everyone should be treated the same, irrespective of the colour of their skin. So what is the balance to strike there, in your opinion?
Well, I think that a fundamental of our liberal democracy is equality before the law. And that means that there shouldn't be any group in our multi-ethnic, multi-faith society which is ultimately the beneficiary of preferential treatment. That simply contradicts equality before the law. And I think it's very important to know which groups may be disproportionately represented in various forms of criminal activity. Because that's very important in terms of profiling purposes and actually addressing problematic social and cultural norms, which may be more powerful within certain ethnic and religious communities. And I think that there's been various studies which show that when it comes to group-based child sexual exploitation and abuse, that men of Pakistani Muslim origin, especially those who work in the nighttime economy, are disproportionately represented when it comes to that particular form of what I'd consider to be street-based grooming. And I don't think we can shy away from that. And I think that shying away from that does more harm than good when it comes to maintaining positive community relations in our country.
There's been a lot of talk this last week, because it is the anniversary of the Southport attack. And this time last year, there were riots across Britain. How have you reflected on that time, especially through the lens of policing in Britain, but also how heavy-handed should the police be when they're faced with a situation that, they are attacked and they need to defend themselves. How do you think it's changed since the riots?
Well, Natasha, I'd make this point that firstly, just going back to the Manchester airport fracas, I think we would have seen a very different outcome if that took place in a major international airport in Asia, or particularly the Indian subcontinent, if not other European capitals, if I'm being perfectly honest. I think that the outcome for the two brothers could have been much more severe. Put it that way. Going back to Southport, which was it was a truly horrific event. I think, in my view, one of the darkest moments in our modern history. I think this was a fundamental security failure. We now know that the perpetrator behind the horrific Southport atrocity, Axel Rudakabana, was referred to the anti-terror prevent scheme on three separate occasions. But because he didn't have a clearly defined ideological motivation, he slipped through the cracks with devastating consequences. So I think that we need to see how we tackle morbid fascinations with violence, especially among younger males like Axel Rudakabana. If that means establishing a separate scheme, then I think we should look into that. I think that more generally, in terms of the reaction to Southport, in terms of last summer's disorder, I think that as more data has been released, I think it is very clear that much of the disorder took place in relatively deprived areas, especially areas which disproportionately rehomed asylum seekers. In my view, many clearly being illegal small boat migrants. Now, that's no justification for the violence that we witnessed last summer. But I think that what it really shows is that there are many parts of the country that have been starved of meaningful investment for decades, who then disproportionately bear the brunt of the ongoing small boats emergency. And I don't think that we've really learnt the lessons from last year's riots. But I think that this point is also very important, that we've been a bit of a tinderbox for some time. In this decade, we've seen BLM demonstrations turn violent, especially against police officers. We had the Leicester riots in August, September 2022, where ultimately primarily between Hindu and Muslim youths, where many police officers there were also injured. And then just not too long before the Southport riots, we had the public disorder in Hare Hills, after social services took in a number of children from a Romani family. So I think what you can see there is that Southport necessarily didn't come as a surprise to me. If you're looking at public disorder for various motivations, for various reasons, have taken place over the course of this decade. And I think unless we don't get to grips with anti-authority sentiment, which could be motivated by a variety of reasons, then I think that unfortunately there's very much signs to come for in the coming years.
And I wonder how much pressure this case was under in terms of it being a year on from the riots, if the outcome was different, or actually depending on what the sentence is that these two brothers get. I've seen a lot of things online about people saying if they don't get the X sentence, we're gonna kick off again. I wanted to ask you, Rakib, about policing and the training that police officers undergo. You wrote about this for Unheard earlier in July, and actually the woman whose nose was broken in the video, she was a petite 5'2" and 8 stone.
8 stone.
And the video is horrible to watch, being punched in the face.
I've seen that footage of PC Lydia Ward, who had blood streaming down her nose after having it broken by Mohammed Fahir Amaaz. It's distressing to watch, and understandably, she's in absolute agony. And I believe she said in the court proceedings that she felt absolutely terrified during the experience. I think the real question is, I know that it's an admittedly sensitive question, and I received my fair share of backlash on the back of the Unheard piece, is should a PC Lydia Ward been so exposed in such a situation to begin with? By her own admission, she's petite. At 5'2", she's below the average height for women in the UK. And I believe that 8 stone would be in the region of 50 kilograms, which is not a hefty weight by any stretch of the imagination, to be honest. And I think what we need to talk about here is to what extent are strength and fitness assessments part of the recruitment process across police forces. Now, of course, there's other skills such as conflict management, risks assessment, and indeed interpersonal skills, which form important parts of policing activity. But I think that when it comes to events such as the Manchester airport altercation, I think having those short bursts of speed and strength, I think that's integral when it comes to dealing with the unpredictable and volatile nature of frontline policing. So I think that there is a debate to be had in terms of to what extent existing police training and recruitment procedures focused on strength and fitness testing. I know that one example is the bleep test. That seems to be part of police fitness training, but I think that's ultimately a test of aerobic capacity and stamina. That's not so much chasing someone down very quickly, or indeed dealing with an altercation in a high pressure situation. So I think that we really need to look into that. We need to look at how policing resources are deployed, because I think, in my view, PC Lydia Ward should not have been in that situation.
And do you think it's just a matter of who would want to be a police officer now? So if someone like this woman is a police officer, they're just going to have whoever on the front line and not do these fitness tests because the supply is so short.
No, no, absolutely, and I think that what we need to look into is the point that you raised earlier about sentencing. Is the sentencing surrounding assaults on emergency workers tough enough in the country? Assaults against police officers on a steadily upward trajectory in the last few years. Now, that could be for a variety of reasons. That could be possibly down to the growth in anti-authority sentiment, lack of respect and trust in law enforcement. But there is also the possibility that more and more frontline police officers are seen by those with a violent appetite as physically soft targets. And that's a very real possibility. And if that is the case, that needs to be reversed with urgency.
Yes, I suppose there is the argument that if you have a female police officer, one would have hoped that in our society that they actually have a de-escalating effect in many cases. And there is a possibility that this is a really unique case that a criminal would punch a female police officer in the face. And of course, I know in prisons, they've had a similar drive. They've tried to increase female prison officers because there is a culture in prisons that you're not going to be violent towards a female prison officer. But actually that sparked up a different problem, which is that...
Yeah, the development of intimate relationships between probation, prison officers and the inmates. So that opened a can of worms, you could say. But I think that's such a good point you raise, Natasha. And I think, unfortunately, that's a pitfall of multiculturalism. I think policing by consent in such an ethnically and religiously heterogeneous society is very, very difficult. Now, many people would have felt, well, actually, the presence of female police officers, as you say, would have that de-escalating effect. But there are certain communities which have very different norms when it comes to the protection of women and girls, and in terms of and indeed violence towards women and girls as well. So I think that thinking has exposed itself to be rather misguided, unfortunately.
Very interesting to talk to you, Rakib. Thank you for joining us on Spectator TV.
Thank you for having me.